Years, she lived according to expectations that were never truly hers. Family, society, and relationships quietly shaped her choices, teaching her what was normal and what should never be questioned. She learned how to fit in, how to behave, and how to silence parts of herself that felt confusing or inconvenient. On the surface, her life looked stable. Inside, it felt unfinished. There were moments when she believed she was strong and certain, and other moments when she felt like a stranger in her own skin. She often asked herself whether she was genuinely happy or simply comfortable with what was familiar. That question scared her, so she kept it buried under routines, responsibilities, and forced clarity. Some feelings didn't fit into the simple boxes she had been taught to use. They weren't loud, but they were persistent. She noticed connections forming in ways she couldn't easily explain, emotions that didn't follow the rules she had grown up believing were absolute. Instead of exploring them, she ignored them, hoping they would fade on their own. But they never did. The more she avoided understanding herself, the heavier the confusion became. She feared that self-discovery would demand change, and change meant risk. It could disrupt relationships, invite judgment, and force her to confront truths she wasn't ready to name. So she chose silence, convincing herself that not knowing was safer than knowing too much. Yet, deep down, she sensed the cost of that silence. A quiet emptiness followed her, even in moments that were supposed to feel complete. She wasn't broken, but she wasn't whole either. And without realizing it, this unresolved confusion became the starting point for every decision that followed, especially the ones she would later question the most. Some questions lived quietly inside her, unanswered and unnamed. They surfaced in fleeting moments, late at night, during long silences, or when she caught herself feeling something she couldn't explain. Instead of exploring them, she pushed them aside. She had learned early that certain questions were dangerous, not because they were wrong, but because they challenged what was familiar. She wondered why some connections felt deeper than expected, why certain emotions didn't fit into the narrow definitions she had accepted as truth. These thoughts didn't come with clear answers, only uncertainty. And uncertainty, to her, felt like a threat. She feared that asking the wrong question might unravel the life she had carefully built. So she stayed quiet. She told herself that curiosity was unnecessary, that understanding everything wasn't required to live a good life. Many people lived without questioning who they were or what they felt. So why couldn't she? This reasoning gave her temporary comfort, but it never brought peace. The questions waited patiently, growing heavier with time. Sometimes, she caught glimpses of herself in others, people who seemed honest about their complexity, unafraid to admit that identity and emotion were not simple. Those moments stirred something inside her, a mix of admiration and fear. She wanted that clarity, but she wasn't ready to face what it might cost. Avoiding the questions didn't make them disappear. It only gave them more power. The longer she ignored them, the more disconnected she felt from herself. She was living, functioning, and moving forward, but without direction. There was a sense that something essential remained unexplored, locked behind her reluctance to ask. This quiet avoidance became a habit, and without realizing it, her fear of questions slowly shaped her decisions, preparing the ground for compromises she would later struggle to understand, let alone accept. He had a way of explaining things that sounded reasonable, even noble. When he talked about freedom, he didn't frame it as distance or escape. He framed it as honesty. He said love shouldn't feel like a cage, that real connection allowed space to breathe, to grow, to explore. His words were calm, confident, and persuasive. At first, she admired that certainty. It felt mature, evolved, different from the possessive ideas of love she had grown up with. He wasn't demanding anything, at least not openly. He presented his views as options, as philosophies, not ultimatums. That made it harder to question them. Still, something about the way he spoke unsettled her. Freedom, the way he described it, always seemed to benefit him more than her. When she hesitated, he reassured her gently, saying that discomfort was just conditioning, not truth. He suggested that fear came from society, not from her own feelings. She listened because she wanted to understand him. She didn't want to be the reason things felt limited or small. Part of her worried that disagreeing meant she was closed-minded, insecure, or holding him back. So she absorbed his words, even when they clashed with her instincts. Over time, his idea of love began to replace her own. She started questioning whether her need for emotional security was a flaw. Maybe wanting clarity meant she lacked depth. Maybe freedom really was the purest form of trust. But the more she tried to adopt his language, the more distant she felt from herself. His version of love sounded logical, but it didn't feel safe. And although he spoke softly, his certainty slowly drowned out her doubts, until she couldn't tell whether she was choosing this path freely or simply learning to justify it. The thought didn't arrive suddenly. It surfaced slowly, in fragments. Memories she hadn't examined, feelings she had once dismissed as admiration or coincidence. When the word bisexual finally crossed her mind, it didn't shock her as much as she expected. Instead, it made certain moments quietly make sense. That realization unsettled her, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt real. She had been taught that identity was supposed to be clear, fixed, and easy to explain. This wasn't. It was layered, emotional, and personal. She worried that acknowledging it would complicate everything she already struggled to hold together. She questioned herself repeatedly. Was this genuine, or was she being influenced? Was she discovering something true, or simply responding to the environment she was in? The uncertainty scared her, but denial felt dishonest. For the first time, she wasn't trying to impress anyone or meet expectations. She was simply noticing her own feelings. Accepting the possibility didn't mean she had answers. It meant she stopped running from the questions. She didn't label herself out loud, and she didn't rush to define what it meant. She allowed the idea to exist without judgment, even if she wasn't ready to fully understand it. There was relief in that quiet acceptance. Not freedom in action, but freedom in honesty. She wasn't changing herself, she was recognizing herself. That distinction mattered more than she realized. Still, honesty came with fear. She knew that naming this part of herself could be misunderstood, even used against her. She wondered whether this truth belonged to her alone, or whether it would soon become something others would shape and interpret for her. And as she sat with that realization, she didn't yet know how it would be used, only that it had opened a door she could no longer pretend wasn't there. Even as she allowed herself to acknowledge new truths, fear never stayed far behind. It wasn't the fear of what she felt. It was the fear of how those feelings would be seen. She imagined reactions before they ever happened. Disappointment, misunderstanding, labels she didn't choose. Judgment, she knew, didn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as concern or advice. She had grown up learning which parts of herself were acceptable and which were better left unspoken. Stepping outside those lines felt risky. The idea that people might reduce her to a single word, ignoring her complexity, made her hesitate. She didn't want to be defined by something she was still trying to understand herself. So she stayed cautious. She measured her words, softened her thoughts, and kept most of her reflections private. Curiosity pulled her forward, but fear slowed every step. She wondered if self-honesty was worth the potential cost. Was knowing herself deeply more important than belonging comfortably? At times, she convinced herself that silence was maturity, that not making things complicated was a form of strength. But the longer she held back, the heavier that silence became. It wasn't protecting her, it was shrinking her. She noticed how easily people judged what they didn't understand, how quickly stories were rewritten about others' lives. That awareness made her more careful, but also more lonely. Carrying unanswered questions alone felt safer than facing them in public, yet it left her feeling unseen. Still, curiosity never disappeared. It waited patiently beneath the fear, reminding her that judgment from others was temporary, but living disconnected from herself could become permanent. And slowly, that realization began to shift the balance. For the first time in a long while, she didn't rush to define herself. She resisted the pressure to choose a side, a label, or a clear answer. Everything around her seemed to demand certainty. People liked neat explanations, but she wasn't ready for one. And this time, she decided that was okay. She allowed herself to sit with confusion without treating it as a failure. Some days felt calm, others overwhelming. There were moments when she felt close to clarity and moments when everything blurred again. Instead of panicking, she tried to observe her feelings honestly, without judging where they came from or where they might lead. Giving herself time felt unfamiliar. She was used to solving problems quickly, to adjusting before anyone noticed discomfort. But this wasn't a problem to fix. It was a part of her to understand. The difference mattered. She began to realize that forcing answers too early would only replace one kind of confusion with another. Her partner often spoke about openness and courage, subtly encouraging her to move faster. She listened, but she didn't immediately follow. This was the first boundary she set quietly, even if she didn't name it out loud. She needed space to think without influence, without expectation. In that space, she noticed small truths forming. Not conclusions, just signals. What felt heavy, what felt honest, what felt wrong when rushed. She learned that clarity grows slowly, not under pressure. Time didn't erase her uncertainty, but it softened her fear. It taught her that self-understanding isn't proven by speed, but by patience. And although she still didn't know where her choices would lead, she finally felt like they would be hers. When the conversation finally became serious, she didn't agree blindly. She asked questions, careful ones, thoughtful ones. If anything was going to change, she needed clarity first. Vague ideas about freedom weren't enough. She wanted to know what honesty would actually look like, where respect would begin and end, and how boundaries would be protected rather than tested. They talked about transparency, about saying things early instead of hiding them until damage was done. She emphasized that respect wasn't optional, it was the foundation. No comparisons, no manipulation, no emotional games. Whatever shape the relationship took, it had to preserve dignity on both sides. Boundaries mattered most to her. Not rules meant to control, but limits meant to protect. She needed reassurance that her feelings wouldn't be dismissed as insecurity whenever they became inconvenient. She needed to know that openness wouldn't be used as an excuse to ignore her discomfort. Agreeing on these terms gave her a sense of stability, at least temporarily. It felt responsible, even mature. She believed that if everything was clearly defined, pain could be avoided, or at least managed. Structure, she hoped, would keep emotions from spiraling. Still, a quiet doubt lingered. She wondered whether boundaries spoken in calm conversations could survive real emotions. It was one thing to agree on respect in theory, another to practice it when feelings became complicated. But at that moment, clarity felt like progress. She wasn't saying yes to chaos. She was saying yes to conditions. And that distinction allowed her to move forward, believing she had protected herself as much as possible. Whether those boundaries would hold was a question for later. For now, she trusted the agreement and hoped it would be enough. What finally pushed her forward wasn't excitement. It was honesty. She had grown tired of pretending, of adjusting herself to fit a version of life that looked right but felt incomplete. Living quietly, without conflict, had once seemed like peace. Now it felt like a slow denial of her own reality. She told herself that truth, even when uncomfortable, was more respectful than silence. If she was going to stay in the relationship, she wanted it to be built on what was real, not on what was convenient. Hiding parts of herself felt heavier than facing the possible consequences of revealing them. This belief gave her courage, but it also softened her resistance. She began to see openness as a moral choice rather than an emotional risk. If everyone was honest, she reasoned, then no one was being deceived. Pain caused by truth seemed easier to justify than pain caused by lies. Still, there was a difference between choosing honesty and being prepared for its impact. She underestimated how vulnerable truth could make her. Speaking openly didn't just expose facts. It exposed feelings, insecurities, and hopes she hadn't fully processed. She believed that by choosing truth, she was choosing strength. In some ways, she was right. She wasn't hiding anymore. But honesty didn't guarantee safety. It only guaranteed clarity. As she stepped into this decision, she didn't see it as surrender. She saw it as integrity, a way to stop betraying herself quietly. What she didn't yet realize was that truth, once spoken, can be shaped by others, and sometimes used in ways you never intended. For now, she held on to the idea that honesty would protect her, that living openly, even imperfectly, was better than disappearing behind silence. And with that belief, she took the next step, hoping truth would be enough to hold everything together. In the beginning, everything felt manageable. She approached the situation carefully, telling herself that awareness was the same as control. Because she had agreed knowingly, she believed she was prepared. There were rules, conversations, and mutual understanding, at least on the surface. That structure gave her confidence. She monitored her feelings closely, almost like an observer of her own reactions. When discomfort appeared, she explained it away as adjustment. Change always felt strange at first, she reminded herself. Growth wasn't supposed to be comfortable. As long as she stayed honest with herself, she thought, nothing would spiral. There was also a quiet sense of pride. She felt mature for facing something difficult instead of avoiding it. She told herself she was choosing courage over fear, openness over limitation. That belief helped her stay calm, even when uncertainty crept in. In conversations, she presented herself as steady and composed. She didn't want to appear fragile or doubtful. Showing confidence felt important, not just to her partner, but to herself. If she looked strong enough, maybe she would feel strong enough too. Yet control, she slowly learned, is easiest before emotions are tested. At this stage, everything still lived in theory. Feelings hadn't collided yet. No deep comparisons had been made. No quiet nights had been disrupted by thoughts she couldn't silence. Still, she held on to the idea that preparation would protect her. She believed that because she had chosen this path consciously, she could guide her emotions along with it. For now, that belief brought calm. She didn't know yet that control is often temporary, not because of weakness, but because emotions don't follow plans. And the moment they stop listening, understanding becomes far more difficult than agreeing ever was. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment she could point to and say, this is where it started. Instead, the feeling crept in quietly, disguised as small thoughts she tried not to take seriously. A pause in a conversation, a change in tone, a detail she hadn't expected to hear. She told herself this reaction was normal and temporary. Emotions, she believed, could be managed if acknowledged early. But knowing where a feeling comes from doesn't always make it easier to live with. The more she tried to stay rational, the more irrational her thoughts seemed to become. Jealousy surprised her the most. She hadn't expected it to feel so personal, so physical. It wasn't anger, it was comparison. Questions formed without permission. Am I enough? Am I replaceable? Do I matter in the same way I used to? These thoughts embarrassed her. She didn't want to feel possessive. She didn't want to contradict the values she had agreed to. So she stayed quiet. Insecurity didn't always show itself as fear. Sometimes it appeared as distance. Other times as overthinking things that once felt simple. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for meaning that might not have been there. Trust, which had once felt solid, began to feel conditional, dependent on reassurance she didn't know how to ask for. She questioned herself more than the situation. Maybe she just wasn't strong enough. Maybe this discomfort was proof that she still had work to do on herself. That idea kept her silent longer than it should have. What she didn't yet realize was that jealousy wasn't the problem. It was a signal, a sign that something important inside her was being challenged. And ignoring that signal wouldn't make it disappear. It would only make it harder to understand later. Outwardly, nothing seemed wrong. She laughed at the right moments, nodded during conversations, and reassured everyone, including herself, that she was fine. Smiling became a habit, a shield. It was easier than explaining emotions she didn't fully understand and harder than she wanted to admit. Inside, though, the weight was growing. Each unspoken feeling added pressure. Each dismissed discomfort settled deeper. She didn't want to be seen as dramatic or needy. She feared that voicing her pain would be interpreted as weakness, or worse, as regret. So she chose endurance over honesty, convincing herself that strength meant silence. She became careful with her emotions, editing them before they reached the surface. What hurt her, she softened. What confused her, she ignored. Over time, this constant self-control exhausted her. The gap between how she felt and how she appeared widened, and maintaining it required more energy than she had expected. There were moments when she felt invisible even while being present. Conversations continued, plans were made, life moved forward, but she felt slightly out of step with it all. The version of herself she showed the world no longer matched the one she carried inside. She wondered when she had started prioritizing peace over truth, and whether that peace was real at all. Smiling kept things stable, but it didn't make them safe. It simply delayed the moment when something would have to be acknowledged. What hurt most wasn't the situation itself. It was the realization that she was slowly disappearing from her own life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. And while no one else noticed the cracks forming beneath the surface, she felt every one of them. This was the cost of staying silent. Not conflict, but erosion. And deep down, she knew something would eventually have to change, because no one can keep breaking quietly forever. At some point, the questions she had avoided turned inward. Late at night, in moments of quiet, she asked herself whether what she was experiencing could truly be called freedom. She had agreed to openness, to flexibility, to letting go of traditional expectations, but none of it felt light. Freedom, she thought, was supposed to bring ease, not constant self-doubt. She compared her reality with the promises that had been made. Freedom had been described as choice, as honesty, as relief from pressure. Yet she felt more careful than ever, measuring her emotions, adjusting her reactions, and holding herself together just to keep things balanced. That didn't feel like choice. It felt like maintenance. She wondered whether freedom without emotional safety was simply another kind of confinement. If she had to silence her discomfort to keep things working, was she truly free or just compliant? The thought unsettled her because it challenged the logic she had used to justify everything so far. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that her pain wasn't proof of personal failure. Maybe it was evidence of misalignment. Maybe freedom wasn't about how much you could tolerate, but about how much of yourself you were allowed to be without shrinking. This realization didn't bring immediate clarity. It brought discomfort and a quiet sense of awakening. She saw how easily powerful words could lose meaning when they weren't grounded in mutual care. Freedom, she realized, wasn't a concept. It was a feeling. And right now, she didn't feel free. That question, what does freedom actually look like for me, changed everything. It didn't demand an answer right away, but it refused to be ignored. And once she asked it honestly, she knew she couldn't go back to pretending the question didn't exist. The clarity didn't arrive dramatically. It came as a calm, almost painful understanding. She saw how often she had adjusted her boundaries to avoid discomfort, not because she wanted to, but because she feared losing what she had. Each compromise had seemed small, reasonable, even mature. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. She began to recognize the difference between choice and pressure. Choice felt steady, aligned, and honest, even when it was difficult. Pressure felt rushed, justified, and subtly dismissive of her inner voice. Looking back, she saw how often she had said yes while hoping her feelings would catch up later. That realization hurt more than conflict ever could. It meant accepting that no one had forced her outright. She had slowly stepped away from herself, not out of weakness, but out of love, fear, and the desire to be understood. Still, the outcome was the same. She had been shrinking to keep the peace. She stopped framing her discomfort as something to fix within herself. Instead, she asked whether the situation honored who she was becoming. The answer wasn't easy, but it was honest. Compromise, she learned, should never require self-erasure. This wasn't about blame. It was about responsibility. She understood that protecting herself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Ignoring her needs hadn't made the relationship stronger. It had only made her quieter. For the first time, she allowed herself to value alignment over approval. She didn't need everything to end immediately, but she needed to stop pretending that endurance was the same as strength. That awareness marked a turning point. She hadn't changed her situation yet, but she had changed her loyalty. And for the first time in a long while, it belonged to herself. Finding the words took time. She rehearsed them in her mind, softened them, then strengthened them again. She didn't want to accuse or defend. She just wanted to be clear. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, even if her hands weren't. She talked about the difference between agreement and comfort, about how understanding something didn't mean it felt right. She explained that while she had tried to grow into the situation, parts of her were being left behind. This wasn't about jealousy or fear, it was about alignment. She expected resistance, maybe even dismissal. Instead, there was silence. And in that silence, she felt exposed but relieved. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't editing herself. She wasn't choosing the safest version of her truth. She was choosing the most honest one. Speaking openly didn't solve everything. It didn't rewrite the past or guarantee a shared future, but it changed the dynamic. Her feelings were no longer invisible. They existed in the open, where they could be acknowledged, or challenged. She realized how much strength it took to speak without knowing the outcome. Honesty, she learned, wasn't about control. It was about self-respect. Saying how she felt didn't make her demanding. It made her present. Regardless of the response she received, something inside her shifted. She felt grounded in a way she hadn't before. She had stopped negotiating with her own discomfort. She had drawn a line, not to threaten, but to protect herself. This moment wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was decisive. Whatever happened next would happen with her fully included. And that, more than anything, felt like the beginning of something new. She listened carefully to the response, trying not to interrupt, trying not to defend herself. Part of her still hoped that honesty would bring alignment, that being clear would lead to understanding, maybe even change. But as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that they were standing in different places, looking in different directions. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. That almost made it harder. He spoke about his needs with certainty, about how this version of freedom still felt right to him. He acknowledged her feelings, but didn't move toward them. And in that moment, she understood something important. Being heard is not the same as being met. The truth settled quietly between them. No one was wrong, but they were no longer right for each other in the same way. What she needed for safety and connection wasn't compatible with what he wanted to offer. That realization hurt, but it was clean. There was no confusion left to hide behind. She felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. Disappointment for what couldn't be saved. Relief for what no longer needed pretending. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't questioning her feelings or minimizing them. She trusted them. This clarity didn't come with immediate peace. There was sadness and a sense of loss. But there was also dignity. She had spoken honestly, listened honestly, and accepted what was real instead of what was hoped for. The outcome wasn't the ending she imagined, but it was an ending rooted in truth. And that mattered more than holding on to something that required her to keep letting go of herself. Choosing herself didn't feel empowering at first. It felt quiet, heavy, and uncertain. There was no dramatic exit, no sense of victory, just a deep awareness that continuing would mean losing parts of herself she could no longer afford to give up. She grieved what could have been, not just the relationship, but the version of the future she had imagined if things had aligned differently. Letting go wasn't proof of failure, it was proof of honesty. And honesty, she had learned, often asks for courage before it offers peace. Standing alone forced her to face a different kind of fear, the fear of emptiness. But within that space, something unexpected appeared: relief. Without constant negotiation, without measuring her emotions against someone else's comfort, she felt lighter. Not happier yet, but real. She began rebuilding her sense of self slowly. No labels rushed, no explanations owed, just space to feel what felt right, without pressure to justify it. For the first time in a long while, her inner voice wasn't competing with anyone else's. Choosing herself didn't mean rejecting love or connection. It meant refusing to accept love that required her to disappear. She understood now that self-respect isn't loud, it's consistent. It shows up in the decisions you make when no one is watching. She didn't know exactly what came next, and that uncertainty no longer terrified her. She trusted that clarity would come with time, not sacrifice. Whatever relationships awaited her in the future, she knew one thing for certain: she would not abandon herself to keep them.